Welcome to Unit 3, where we're talking about the ancient Greek civilizations. And today we're going to move into our read aloud, where we're talking about the great thinkers of Greece. So, the last two read alouds, we're talking about these great warriors, these big, epic battles. And now we're going to take it and talk about people who think. Interesting. Before we talk about them, let's go through our vocabulary words. We have a nice full chart now. I will read the word. You will repeat those words with me. Independent, summoned, mission, grand, Spartan, ideal, democracy, tribute, prefer. So we have these 5 components we've been talking about, and today we're going to talk more about another contribution. Let's look at our Greek civilization chart for a second. Remember those 3 jobs they've had, and this just gives us this chart helps us remember all the things we've talked about so far. I'm going to tell you this: we have one more contribution and one more leader that we'll be talking about as we wrap up our 3rd unit. Remember, we're here in ancient Greece, and this orange was the ancient Greece civilization, all the land they owned. We've talked about how they had this enemy, the Persian Empire, this huge empire, but guess what? They kept losing, which is pretty amazing, actually. So let's talk about some questions really quick before we get to our read aloud. What do you think it means to be a great thinker? So throughout time, people, what it meant to be a great thinker, people have wondered about the world and they've tried to understand it. They think about why is this happening in our world, and they want to seek to understand why it's happening. Have you ever heard of the word philosophy? What do you think that word means? So this bolded word here, philosophy means it's a set of ideas or beliefs relating to a particular activity or study. And today we're going to be talking about these guys who are philosophers. That means they specifically were thinkers. They were these great thinkers that thought about specific activities or studies. After today's reading, you should be able to analyze the contributions of these Greek philosophers or these great thinkers, people who wanted to figure out what was going on in the world, and demonstrate understanding of the word marvelous. So as we go through our read aloud today, listen carefully to find out who these philosophers or great thinkers of ancient Greece were and what contributions their work provided to the rest of the world. He was the most famous philosopher who ever lived. Remember, a philosopher is someone who studies life, knowledge, and truth. His name was Socrates, and he lived in the city-state of Athens more than 2,000 years ago. So let's say this guy's name together. Ready? Socrates. So he lived in Athens. The stories about Socrates describe him as the most down-to-earth fellow you could ever meet. If someone is down to earth, that means they're being pretty realistic, they're honest, and they're straightforward. These stories, written by his friends and students, tell us all we know about him. For Socrates never wrote anything down himself. According to these stories, there was no one more clever, no one more loyal to his friends, no one so willing to poke fun at himself, and no one as glad to share everyday activities with other people. But the one thing that made Socrates such a great philosopher was that he kept asking questions about why people did such everyday things. So, do you think asking questions is a great way to learn about things? In the stories about Socrates, we hear about him sitting beneath a shady tree or walking with friends, always engaged in curious conversation. In one story, many guests are waiting for him to arrive at a dinner party. The guest and their host, a man named Agathon, are wealthy, well educated young Athenians who talked about sports, politics, and the latest plays. Some help run their families' large farms or travel to faraway lands on business trips as merchants. Some are political leaders in Athens. A few are soldiers. None of them, however, spend their lives like Socrates, just thinking and asking questions to answer other questions. In this story, Socrates is older than the rest of the guests at this party, has almost no money to his name. He wears the same outfit day and night, and he generally walks about without shoes. Yet, in this and other stories we hear politicians, landowners, and soldiers speak of him with great affection or liking and respect. At the dinner party, one Athenian says, "One day, Socrates and I were passing through the marketplace. I bought a number of items for myself, and knowing Socrates has little money, I offered to buy him whatever he wanted." Socrates said this: "One reason for human unhappiness is that people always want more things than they need. When they get those things, they still want more. I think the happiest people are the ones with the least number of things. Just look at all the marvelous things in this marketplace that I don't want." Why doesn't Socrates want any of the marvelous or wonderful things from the market? What does this Athenian story tell us about the kind of person Socrates was? Another dinner guest shares a very different memory of Socrates. During the war, when we were soldiers together in that icy cold winter, everyone else bundled up in as many clothes as possible. But Socrates gave another man his coat and boots, saying, "You need these more than I do." He marched barefoot, even over the ice. Yet he outmarched the rest of us. And when he ran low on food, he still shared his food with others. Yet during the battle, he was the strongest of us all. Why was Socrates such a strong soldier? Do you think his philosophy helped Socrates to be a stronger person? And though I received honors for bravery that day, Socrates was the real hero. Yes, I led the charge, but I became surrounded by enemy soldiers. Just as one of them knocked my sword from my hand, Socrates burst through them, scattering them left and right. Then he glared at them so fiercely they ran away. He found me another sword and then said, "If I had known that making an ugly face could drive the enemy away, I could have won the battle for us. For heavens knows I am ugly enough for that." Does it sound like Socrates had a sense of humor? As the guests finished this retelling, Socrates himself finally arrives for the party. Agathon, the host, insists, "Sit next to me, Socrates, so I can hear your words of wisdom." Socrates laughs. "I fear you'll go thirsty, Agathon, for I have no wisdom for you to hear. I have only questions, not answers." Why did Socrates say he only had questions? Do you think a great philosopher can have answers too? In all of the stories about Socrates, we read that his method of learning and teaching was to ask others questions like, how do you know? And what do you mean? For example, someone might say to him, the way to lead a good life is to give to others. To which Socrates might respond and say, well, how do you know? By asking these questions, Socrates really wanted to cause people to think about their lives and why they do certain things. Otherwise, he would say, we will just repeat the same old mistakes everyone else has made. And when we end up doing good things, shouldn't we try to understand why they are good so that we can do more good things? Somehow, it was always in his company that people had moments of enlightenment. Enlightenment means um, the act of being more aware of the problems or concerns. Of course, some people did not like Socrates. They said he was wasting their time or confusing them by trying to change their minds. Socrates protested, but I cannot change your mind. Only you can do that. Then he would go on his way. Many of Socrates' friends went on to become great leaders of Greece, and many of his students became widely known and respected. One such student was an intelligent fellow named Plato. Poet, champion athlete, and brave soldier, Plato paid close attention to what Socrates said. Later in life, Plato wrote books reporting those wonderful discussions. But as the years passed and Plato became famous himself, he wrote more about his own ideas about the world and less about Socrates. So Plato became another famous philosopher who we're about to talk about some more. Finally, Plato opened a school near a grove of olive trees called the Grove of Academe. The school became famous as the Academy, a word we still use today for some schools. Here, Plato offered classes in all sorts of subjects: history, mathematics, music, literature, law, politics, and more. He would always ask, what do we know about these things? How can we be sure we are correct? How can your knowing lead to greater happiness? Who else to ask these same type of questions? But by the time Plato taught at the academy, Athens had changed. It had gone through a long, terrible war. A terrible disease had swept through the city, a disease that today we might be able to treat with modern medicine. Without such medicine, many Athenians died from this illness. Many of the happy young men and women of Plato's youth did not survive. Life was no longer so easy or happy for them. He then began writing books that asked the questions like, wouldn't life be nicer if we could only, and continued to try to find proof to back up his ideas. Among Plato's students was a young man named Aristotle, and that's Aristotle right here in the picture. Aristotle too wanted to understand people and things, but he looked at them in a way more like Socrates than Plato. Aristotle thought, instead of looking for facts to prove what we already think is true, let us first study the facts and then try to understand what they mean. So Aristotle studied the facts, or things knew were true, and tried to find out more about them. That simple idea would change the world. Aristotle would become the first great observer, studying things he could see and experiment with, such as plants, animals, human beings, and the stars and planets. What is Aristotle observing in this picture? Aristotle's ideas and classifications are still used in science today. Aristotle also believed in the importance of having balance in life. He thought of he thought doing or having too much of one thing, such as staying up too late, eating too many unhealthy foods, or even studying too much, did not allow time for other things you may need to do. Aristotle, like his teacher Plato, also opened a school in Athens. Aristotle's students and the books he wrote spread across Greece and beyond, carrying the Greek ideas to distant lands. Among Aristotle's students was an astonishing or amazing boy who would carry these ideas the farthest of all. His name was Alexander, and you will learn more about him in the next read aloud. So let's go through our comprehension questions. What is a philosopher? What method of learning did Socrates use? So, by that, how did he learn things? What are some of the questions you could ask to learn more about people and the world around you? How are Aristotle's studies important to science today? These philosophers lived in the city-state Athens. Why? Here's a really good question. Why were philosophers more likely to be found in Athens than in Sparta? So we have our word for today, and it's the word marvelous. I will read the word. You repeat it after me. Marvelous. So marvelous has the OUS ending. Anyone remember what that the suffix OUS, what that sound makes? Anyone remember what OUS means? Remember, marvelous means full of. So what do you think the word marvelous means? It means that you're full of excitement or wonderful. So here's a picture of this mountains in Montana, and they're just marvelous. They're full of excellence, and they're so wonderful to see. My aunt's restaurant has many marvelous dishes to eat. What are some things you find that are marvelous? So we're here talking about our Greek civilization chart, and the component we heard about today is the component of contributions. And the contributions that we are talking about are all the ideas, writings from the great philosophers of Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. And here are some statues to kind of show tribute to these three great thinkers. So a lot of the ideas we have in schools and in the world were thanks to these great thinkers. So in your notebook today, what I want you to do is I want you to talk about um, one way the philosophers helped us out. So you could talk about how Aristotle used science. You could talk about how Plato opened up schools. Or you could talk about how Socrates wanted to question everything or to learn by asking questions. So you're going to write a sentence about one of the philosophers and maybe their teachings. Again, as we go into our last two read alouds, we're going to be learning about this great leader who has a sort of a nickname as well for being so great. So stay tuned and get excited for that.